Hey everyone, I hope you're well. This is the story about what if Naruto became Orochimaru's apprentice. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel and like the video as well. So without any further ado, let's start the what if. Good man, she said happily, Makis, at 8, be there. With this, Anko turned around with a swirl of her cloak and walked out, making sure to let her hips sway for the scientists as she left. Naruto slowly shook his head as he dragged back the microscope and peered into it. Anko would probably never change. Bipolar, nice, sadistic and hedonistic, his fellow apprentice was in many ways his polar opposite. Still, Naruto wouldn't deny that she was skilled at what she did. Orochimaru had molded Anko to be a fighter, a warrior and a killer, and that was what she was. Also, after the Kyuubi incident and Naruto's subsequent apprenticeship to Orochimaru, Anko had been one of the reasons he had kept his morals. Naruto wasn't blind or foolish, but he knew that morals were relative things. With hardly any contact with his family or indeed the rest of Konoha, Naruto had been left alone with the snake and his other apprentice. A few years older than him, Anko had been a lifeline for him to normality and to sanity with her constant cheekiness and cheer. As irritating as she might be at time, Naruto did appreciate her, much like how he appreciated Kabuto's aid here at the laboratory. Minato Namikaze felt like a scumbag as he left the office for the day. Closing the door behind him, he stretched his neck and began to make his way through the crooked hallway. His eyes were downcast as his feet automatically found their way through the hallway and down the stairs that were at the end of it. Minato didn't believe that young assistant had been intentionally harsh with what he said. From what he had been told and what he had seen, Kabuto was the quintessential harmless geek, a socially awkward bookworm who didn't have a malicious bone in him. Yet, his comment had cut Minato down to the bone. With no family. It hadn't been the comment itself as much as the many things Minato had realized from it. Things came together for him in seconds after the young assistant's comment. Throwaway comments by other villagers, the whispered rumors he had heard, things that hadn't made any sense up until now. For one, so many people referred to Kimiko as the Hokage's child, amongst other titles. He had always been perplexed by it and guessed it was a turn of phrase or something. Now, he wasn't sure anymore. Was this how Naruto was perceived in Konoha these days? That he was ostracized and cut off from his family, no longer a part of it? Did Konoha see him as the black sheep of the Namikaze family? Orochimaru hadn't been popular in the village, being considered a ruthless and immoral person by most of the villagers. Minato had thought that he had seen something different in Orochimaru though, that had been why he gave Naruto to him, as a way for Orochimaru to prove himself. Yet now, Orochimaru had been all that people had thought he had been, and his son was tainted by the guilt of association with him. Had it gone so far that people thought he had ostracized his son? Put him into a dead-end employment to keep him occupied and under control? Minato knew the science division was considered the lowest of the divisions in Konoha. Real shinobi were meant to be out in the field, not looking into microscopes all day, and employment there was often seen as a dead end for the bookworms. It was with a deep sigh that Minato stopped by the bridge that crossed the stream going through the city. Leaning on the railing, he looked out across the water with his arms folded on the railing and his head resting on the arms. Not in his wildest dreams would he have guessed that this would happen. Naruto was a brilliant boy, his determination to learn and to improve was the most pure Minato had seen, even back when the boy was a child. His perfect solution, supposed to give Naruto a good sensei and give Orochimaru tighter bonds to this village, had backfired, and it had been Naruto who took the blow. Tainted by association with Orochimaru, his father's hesitation in showing him kindness, his own refusal to be apologetic. Kami-sama, what was his son going through? At 6 o'clock Naruto decided to go home. They had achieved enough for today, having discovered the secret behind the poison and started working on possible countermeasures. 12 hours of hard working did take its toll, even on trained shinobi, and Naruto didn't want anyone to mess up. When working with highly toxic blood, he had decided to take safety first. That meant that they'd work in 3 shifts from now on, each covering 8 hours and keeping the wheels constantly spinning. As Naruto made his way through Konoha, his mind was spinning with possible ideas for countermeasures and the appliances of them. It amazed him that he had thought that the hard part had been over. The weakness of this damned bacteria kept eluding him. Still, great discoveries weren't made in a day, so he'd have to be patient. Also, with the lab that was lying below the city, waiting for its master to come back to it and resume its usage, he'd have a lot to do in his spare time from now on. Personnel would be impossible to get for it. He'd instead have to do like his master and make sure it was automated enough to be of use. There was no way he'd be able to use the lab to full capacity. Still, Naruto actually felt an eagerness he hadn't felt in a long time about this whole thing. After several weeks of passiveness and struggling with the slight budget and staffing problems Konoha's research and development division suffered from, it was good to feel that he was starting to recover some of the massive amounts of available capacity he had had during his master's time. The fools of Konoha feared science these days, thought it a vile and destructive power. Science was so tightly linked to Orochimaru these days that any scientist would be seen as virtually the same as him no matter what. The only development people wanted to see was that of singular shinobi developing their own jutsu through years of experimentation. Pointing out that that kind of development was the slowest and most inefficient possible only made them lash out. Evidently, efficiency was associated with evil too. Sometimes he hated people. Their ignorance and stupidity irritated him to the point of teeth-grinding frustration. He knew that logically speaking it was to be expected. Their fears and suspicions about Orochimaru had turned out more correct than anyone would have wanted. Yet, it didn't stop the fact that people were looking at him and his employees with wariness and suspicion these days. It was almost like they had become the village pariahs. As he got to the apartment building where he lived, he fished out the keys out of his pocket and checked the mailbox. Seeing that there was nothing there, he walked up the stairway, avoiding a cat that came running down at the same time as he was walking upwards. It seemed that the old woman at the end of the hall had left the door open again. His apartment was one of the standardized ones, with about 40 square meters of space. The left part of the cross-shaped hallway led to a large bedroom that doubled as living room and with windows against the east where the sun would rise. Naruto had also put in several bookshelves and a work desk there. The bathroom, positioned to the right, was quite small, only barely fitting in the shower, sink and toilet, but at least it was newly renovated and clean. Several lockers made up the walls in the hallway and gave ample storage space where he kept his uniforms and clothes. Due to his limited amounts of clothes, he had even managed to store some books there too. Straight ahead was the kitchen, lying in a room shaped like an L with the dining table hidden behind the wall. Naruto had moved into this apartment about 4 years ago when he had started to earn enough from the missions and work his master did that he could get his own place. He hadn't been comfortable at home, feeling like an unwelcome stranger in the family where his father was a distant and constantly working figure and his mother focusing all she had on his sister. When Naruto came to his door, he had only grabbed the handle before he realized something. The door was unlocked. True to his training, Naruto's body tensed at once and his heart began to pound faster as it readied for battle. His mind worked at top speed as he reached into his clothes and took out the kunai and the poison senbon he carried there at all times. Having pressed himself against the wall beside the door, Naruto held the weapons in one hand and took out a mirror which he used to glance inside the slightly ajar door. He couldn't see anything inside there, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Assassins? Naruto thought about the possible enemies of Konoha and which factions that could benefit from his death. But no, assassins wouldn't leave the door open. A burglar? Was someone stupid enough to break into a shinobi apartment? Yet, when the smell came wafting from inside the apartment, however, Naruto's battle readiness came crashing down in seconds. A groan escaped him as he pocketed the mirror and weapons before he slowly pushed his head into the wall, suddenly feeling so very exhausted. Getting up from his hunching position, Naruto walked inside. Making his way inside the apartment, he went directly for the kitchen. As he entered it, he came eye to eye with a person that currently was seated at one of the chairs at the table. Said person was very small, even smaller than people that age usually was. In fact, this person stood only about 130 centimeters tall. However, the vibrantly green eyes and the blazing red hair did a lot to compensate for the stature. The round face with the whisker marks on the cheek was also noticeable, as were the brightly colored clothes, a kimono-style vest as well as both arm and leg warmers in orange with red details, and black bicycle shorts. Finally, the fact that she was currently slurping down a whole can of instant ramen made her impossible to not notice. Namikaze Kimiko, jinchuuruki of the Kyuubi, Konoha Academy student and unfortunately, his sister. "Hey Onai-san," his sister said with a smile, just having slurped down the last of the ramen she was eating. "How's work?" "Exhausting," Naruto said, blinking at what he saw. The workbench in the kitchen was covered by empty ramen cans, he counted at least a dozen of them. "What are you doing in my apartment?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Mom told me I can't eat ramen at the house anymore," Kimiko said as she went over to the bench and opened another can of ramen which she filled with hot water from the boiler. Shaking it, she then took another can standing there and pulled off the lid, making steam come out. Naruto's sweat dropped. Was she queuing the ramen now, preparing another can while she ate? Seeing that kind of methodical efficiency when something like ramen was concerned chafed with Naruto somehow. "So I just figured I'd come here to eat instead," Kimiko finished as she sat down with the new can in front of her. Naruto ended up staring at his sister. This girl was unbelievable. "Wait," he said now, rubbing his temples. "Run that past me again. Are you planning to use my apartment as a storage space for ramen?" Kimiko smiled brightly at him and smiled. "It's a perfect plan," she said, her mouth filled with ramen that hung out of it, like a beard. She swallowed before she continued, "They won't stop me going here, right? And I won't disturb you since you always work. Everyone becomes happy." Naruto only looked at her for a second before he walked towards one of the cupboards. Suddenly he needed something to drink. When he opened the cupboard where he kept his tea, his eyes suddenly widened as an avalanche came crashing down on him. It was a tidal wave, a deluge, and Naruto had no chance to stop it before it was too late. Gah! With a shocked and undignified sound, Naruto was thrown to the floor as the tidal wave of ramen cans buried him alive. Kimiko shot to her feet with her eyes wide, knocking over her ramen cup in the process. "Onai-san," she yelled in panic and threw herself on the giant pile of cans. She began to rummage through it as fast as she could, only to have Naruto's head rise from the middle of the ramen pile. His eyes were glaring daggers at her and he didn't seem to notice the packet of shrimp ramen that was resting on his head. "How many cans did you bring here?" he asked calmly, removing the can from his head as he rose to his feet, towering nearly 1.5 feet above his short sister. Like with the rest of his family, he didn't feel any hate for Kimiko. What did feel, however, was a monumental annoyance over her personality. Kimiko grinned with an embarrassed look on her face as she scratched the back of her head. About 200. She said. Naruto hit her now. With his hand, he gave her a light hand chop on the head. It wasn't painful, but it was effective. Kimiko flinched and closed her eyes as her head sunk down a few centimeters. "Idiot," he said to her, "are you planning to live your entire life on this slop?" "Ramen isn't slop," Kimiko protested shrilly before Naruto raised his hand again, making her stop. "It's a slop consisting of salt and fat," Naruto said. "It's the most useless food there is, providing nothing necessary or even healthy." "And where's did you put the things that were in there before?" he continued, pointing at the cupboard. Kimiko, who was just about to vehemently defend her beloved ramen, was stopped in her tracks now. A confused blinking happened in her face as her eyes opened and closed. For about 3 seconds she looked like an owl before she opened her mouth. Oh, she said slowly. Naruto sighed now and walked over to the sink. Opening the locker below the sink, he peered into the trash can, a sense of hopelessness in him. Sure enough, the tea he had bought a few weeks ago was mashed down into the trash along with the other things he had had in that locker. "Kimiko," Naruto said as he looked into the trash. His voice was as calm and gentle as it could be, but Naruto could outright feel how Kimiko froze behind him. "Come over here," he continued, speaking with a calm and soothing voice. He didn't look back, but he could tell that Kimiko was currently approaching, no doubt shaking life a leaf. Naruto pointed into the bin as Kimiko came up to him, making her look down into the cupboard. The girl silently obliged and steadily refused to make eye contact with him. "You see that bag of tea there?" he asked, making Kimiko nod. "That tea costs about 20 ryo a pound. I had just bought it." At this, Kimiko flinched. "Other things too, the crackers, the rice, you threw my food away." As usual, Kimiko never thought before she acted. Naruto could imagine her rushing over here and getting into the house, opening a cupboard and throwing out everything that was there to stow her ramen there. "You can take some of my ramen," Kimiko said in a tiny voice. However, Naruto shook his head. "I don't like ramen," he said. "I like nutritious food, like the food you've just thrown away. Do you understand? It is like I'd replace your ramen with vegetables. Look at me," Naruto continued. Kimiko didn't move though. "Look at me," Naruto said again. Now Kimiko slowly moved, turning to look up at him. He was met with two giant tear-filled eyes, his sister on the very edge of crying. Her eyes were large and tear-filled, about to spill over, and her lower lip was trembling. A whimper seemed about to spill over her lips. His sister was about to start crying, seemingly having understood what she had done and reacted on this in her usual instant fashion. Naruto sighed before he reached up and patted her on the head, making the girl's eyes widen as she seemed to calm down. Little thoughtless, impulsive and energetic Kimiko, the girl carried her heart on her sleeve and could go from rage to sadness on a moment's notice. As Naruto patted the girl's head, she turned to look up at him and smiled, an errant tear making its way down the side of her face. Kimiko wiped it away with her sleeve. "Sorry, Onisen," she said sheepishly. "Do you want me to pick it up and clean it off?" "You take the ramen cups," Naruto said, and stacked them properly this time. Kimiko nodded and Naruto reached down into the trash bin, feeling very grateful for the facts that all those things had been in sealed wrappings and that he just had taken out the trash yesterday. It was then that he heard the "eep" from Kimiko and looked back to see what had happened. Kimiko's ramen cup had been knocked over and the broth was now covering the entire table, drenching both it and the floor in broth. Naruto didn't even react now, only pulling back to get the rag from the sink. Glancing at the clock, he saw that he had about 40 minutes left before he was supposed to be at Maki's. He just hoped that he could clean this up too without Kimiko causing any more chaos. Having managed to chase Kimiko out of his apartment, Naruto had gotten himself a quick something to eat and showered. As it was now, however, he was forced to use Shunshin to get to Maki's in time, having left the apartment with only 5 minutes to spare. Thankfully, Kimiko had not set the apartment on fire, and as soon as she had stacked the ramen, he had chased her out. When she had asked what he was doing, all he had to do was to mention Anko and she had instantly fled, slinking out of Naruto's apartment like a greased weasel. Kimiko and Anko had met 2 times before. Both those times the woman had terrified Kimiko to the point that the girl these days would be frightened by the mere mention of her name. Especially the second time came to mind. Kimiko had called a by then 18-year-old Anko an old lady, provoking Anko to chase Kimiko halfway around Konoha with a kunai in each hand. It was with a huge jump that Naruto reached one of the taller rooftops in Konoha and looked out across the city. Looking down, he could spot Anko standing by one of the walkways hanging over the main street. The unique thing about the bar she had told him to come to was that it was located high above the streets, at a place that was impossible to reach unless you were trained, i.e. a shinobi. The owner was a well-known eccentric, but the shinobi-only clientele was appreciated by many people. Naruto got down on the street with one accurate Shunshin, appearing in a swirl of leaves right next to Anko. Anko turned to look at him, surprised but not startled by his sudden arrival. Looking down at his watch, Naruto saw that he had arrived on the second. "Right on time," he said as the leaves finally dispersed. Anko blinked before she started to laugh. A bark of Anko's trademark laughing, a low semi-chuckle, could be heard from her as she looked at him. "Good grief, Naruto," she said, "you've gotten that anal about appointments?" She laughed again after this, seemingly already a bit tipsy. Naruto only shook his head though. "It was Kimiko," he said dryly. "She had broken into my apartment to store ramen there, In about 5 minutes she wrecked half the kitchen and I had to clean up. Anko stopped laughing now. 4a. Second, she looked at Naruto with a strange look on her face before she begun to laugh again, this time almost howling with laughter. Anko's almost malicious laughter rung through the streets before the young woman could recover and took a deep breath. Holy shit, Naruto, doesn't that brat ever grow up? She asked, provoking Naruto to shake his head. I'm seriously starting to wonder about that, he admitted as they both leaped high skywards and landed on the board that formed the porch for the bar. Deftly balancing on it, they both headed into the inn. It was a large, circular room with several round tables arranged in 2 circles, the smaller inside the larger and the smaller positioned on a lightly raised part of the floor. In the middle of the room a giant pole went right through the building, being what held the bar this high up in the air. At the far end of the room the bar was located. The mood inside the room was quite dampened, the lights were dimmed and the volume was low. About 24 shinobi sat scattered in small group amongst the low tables, seated upon the pillows used to sit on. The smell of cut wood inside the house was thick, giving the place a distinct but yet mild smell that to Naruto's enhanced senses was quite refreshing. The soft fragrances, the dim lighting and the music played by an old man holding a shamisen made this place an oasis in many ways. Here shinobi could retreat to a place where the senses were dulled and soothed, a place of rest and comforting emptiness. Naruto could spot several ninjas he recognized. In one corner, sitting alone, Marino Ibiki was seated, sitting with his back against the wall, one leg pulled up to his chest and the other stretched outwards, the table beside him and several sake bottles lined up on it. As usual, his grim face was unreadable. Further away a group of shinobi were discussing something over Maki's special, a giant bottle of sake easily about 2 liters big. Naruto could recognize Shiranui Genma, Yamashiro Aoba and Namishi Rado amongst the group. Anko plopped herself down on one of the lower circle tables, making sure she took a space with a window down towards the village. She looked up at Naruto and grinned as she made a gesture. You go get some drink, she said cheekily, I'm the birthday child after all. She leaned back against the wall now, folding her hands behind her head and crossing her legs. Leaning back. Like this she raised one eyebrow and looked at him expectantly. Naruto put down his jacket by the table and headed towards the bar. Well, there he was met by the old and almost infirm Maki, the woman who ran this place. How the old woman kept getting up here was anyone's guess, she was old enough that jumping was impossible for her. Hello there Namikaze-san, the old woman said politely. What can I get you? 2 bottles of sake. Naruto said, thinking about how Orochimaru had given them sake several times. The man had meant that they'd have to be able to master anything adults could in order to master infiltration missions. Naruto had been capable of drinking sake easily at the age of 12. Still, it was first now that he had started to consider it a relaxing pastime. Warm? The woman asked and Naruto nodded. Tobikiri-kan, he said, ordering the warmest sake available. The woman nodded and soon 2 bottles with hot sake stood in front of him. Carefully taking the bottles by the necks, he made his way over to the table again, the cups balancing on the backs of his hands. Reaching their table, he put down 1 bottle in front of Anko, who made a smacking sound with her tongue. Yum! Anko said now, straightening herself up and turning so she sat by the table properly. Naruto sat down and carefully poured up his sake, some steam rising from it. Tobikiri-kan meant that the sake was at least 55 degrees Celsius warm when you drank it and it was easy to burn your tongue. The very name, Tobikiri-kan, meant hot enough to jump up. As he finished, Anko had readied her glass too, and she looked at him with a challenging grin. Ready? She asked, making Naruto look at her with a raised eyebrow. The smile on Anko's face said more than 1,000 words and Naruto instantly got what she meant. As you wish, he said, taking the cup in his hand. Kanpai, he said to her. Kanpai. Anko replied with a cheer, taking the small cup and downing the contents all at once. Naruto followed suit and swallowed the sake as swiftly as he could, feeling the intense burn as the sake made its way down his throat. No matter who you were, swallowing sake that hot was not easily done. The burn would remain as it traveled down your throat, seemingly sizzling your innards, before it settled in the gut where it would feel like you had swallowed coal for a while. Naruto's eyes widened as he crossed his arms in front of him and leaned forwards, Anko gasping as she started pounding her fist into the table. Holy shit, she croaked, feels like I've deep-throated an oni. She started breathing deeply and her eyes were blinking rapidly with tears starting to form. Naruto didn't say anything at first. This was partly because he wasn't able to, but also since he saw the quip and thought it too easy to go on. In the end he decided to do it anyway since she'd most probably be annoyed if he didn't. I don't even know how you'd know what that's like, he said, taking a deep breath and recovering. Anko laughed at this and poured up another cup of the hot sake. Well, not all of us are spending all our time in a lab, Anko said innocently. If you ever peeked out of your testing tubes you might discover quite a lot, you might even get laid. I'd rather unravel the secrets of reality than stick my penis in someone and grunt for an hour only to get an endorphin rush for my troubles. Naruto deadpanned, making Anko collapse from laughter. It wasn't loud, but Anko nevertheless collapsed onto the table, lying with her face buried in her arms as she shook with laughing. It took a good while before she could look up at Naruto again, her face red from laughing now. You so have to get laid, she snickered as she took her sake glass and swept it in one deft move. Naruto followed suit and yet again the burning sensation made him tense up and choke. As he recovered, he looked up at Anko and sighed. I have gotten laid, he said, didn't you know that? Anko blinked now, looking at him. No I didn't, she said. The heck, when did that happen? She looked genuinely surprised now. It was 3 years ago. Naruto explained. Orochimaru wanted to complete my infiltration training and dragged me off to a brothel in the capital, quite a high-class place too. He grabbed hold of one of the older prostitutes, somewhere around 30 I think she was, even though she seemed younger. He told her to show me what it meant to be a man. 1 hour later it was done. Apparently I am a natural. Naruto spoke of the whole thing with an utterly disinterested voice and took a small sip of the sake. This actually works better at small sips, he added, looking up at Anko. Suddenly the woman fell forward again, her head smacking against the table. So you were a virgin who got to screw an experienced high-class whore. She whispered, you last for a goddamn hour, and you act like we're talking about the newspaper deliveries after that? Anko was suddenly almost frightened by Naruto. How the bloody hell could that boy remain that impassive? She looked up at Naruto only to see him shrug. It was enjoyable, he said, don't get me wrong. But I can't see what all the fuss about sex comes of. I mean, sex, people talk about it all the time. If it's not this then it's that and all is sex. I've gotten tired of all the constant yapping about it and in the end I felt like it was better to just forget about it. Anko sighed at what Naruto said and took another sip of her sake. Get more booze, she said, making Naruto raised his eyebrow quizzically and raised the bottle to shake it. About half the bottle was still filled. Just do it. Anko snapped, if this is who I'm boozing with I'll need a lot more to make it funny. You were the one who invited me, Naruto pointed out as he got up. What do you want? Sleet, Anko said. This time it was Naruto's turn to sigh. If you end up in hospital tonight I'm not accompanying you. Got it? Anko shrugged and Naruto went over to the bar. From one extreme to another, now it was Mizore, sleet, sake served at below zero temperatures and which actually turned to sleet when you poured it. Naruto dreaded what would come now and he decided to order a bottle of normal sake, served at body temperature. Anko's desire for extreme kicks wasn't one he shared by far. However, as he turned around to look at Anko he felt like sighing. Was she already getting that drunk? At her table Anko had just taken off her coat, now sitting with only the fisuhet shirt covering her torso. Naruto noticed that the group who had been sharing the giant bottle were now glancing at her with an embarrassingly obvious interest. He was half a mind to go sit with Ibiki, seeing as the man kept his eyes to himself. Yet, he was here with her, wasn't he? Naruto walked back to Anko and sat down, putting the bottle of Mizore in front of her. Knock yourself out," he said, putting the normal warm bottle in front of him. "Can you please put on the coat again?" he continued. "You're embarrassing me." "Drink sake," Anko said with a grin as she took her bottle and started to pour the sake. "It helps." The freezing cold sake poured from the bottles, seemingly like diamond dust, and landed in the cup with the faint sounds revealing that it was more sleek than liquid. "I was thinking of getting laid tonight, and this way I kill 2 birds with 1 stone. "What?" Naruto asked, having no way to be able to keep up with Anko's manic train of thought. He stared at the woman in disbelief now, refusing to accept that it was him being thick that stopped him from understanding. The woman had to be crazy. Anko grinned as she took a swig of the sake, soon widening her eyes and getting goosebumps all over her skin as the literally ice-cold sake went down her throat. "Hoo-hee!" Anko cheered. "This feel like going down on a you." "No," Naruto said, cutting Anko off. "I know what you are going to say, don't say it." "But..." Anko begun now, blinking as her lips begun to curve upwards at the grim face he was giving her. "I said no," Naruto said, this time more forcefully and with a glare that drilled into the woman. "And put on your coat again." Naruto wasn't distracted by her lack of clothing, what he was annoyed by it. Anko started to laugh again now, grinning at him like the Cheshire Cat. "Only if you figure out what 2 birds I'm killing with 1 stone here," she said, pouring some more sake for herself as she grinned at him. "Remind me why I subject myself to this," Naruto said. "The first is that you're hoping to make people want to sleep with you, and since you're lazy you prefer to just strip and wait for them to come to you." "Ugh," Anko said now, that one knew where it took, and next? Anko leaned to the side, one arm supporting her head and the other on the table in front of her. The grin was still there. "Other than irritating me, I cannot, and that's the reason," Naruto concluded, missing only half a beat as he understood why Anko was doing this. She wanted to annoy him. Naruto realized he probably just had gotten to eat up his annoying of her earlier this day. "Ding ding ding ding." Anko cheered. "Good boy," she applauded him and put on her coat again. Before Naruto could stop her though, she had confiscated Naruto's cup and poured some of the ice-cold sake into it. "Let's ride," she said as she had poured some for her too. "Kanpai. Kanpai," Naruto said with a sigh, thanking his master for the enhanced alcohol tolerance he had thanks to the genetic modifications. Anko might lack them, but she had built up her own tolerance, and Naruto would need every splice gene he had if he was going to keep up with her. Downing the ice-cold Mizore, he shivered as he was reminded of an assassination mission in the Land of Snow where he had to swim under the ice of a lake to drag the target underwater. The cold had been numbing even with the gear he had used, and the Mizore reminded him of the mouthfuls of ice-cold water he had taken. He shook his head as he felt how the freezing cold actually cleared it somewhat. Still, the taste went to hell. "Let me ask something, Anko," Naruto continued, deciding to address something he had been wondering. Anko looked up at him and smiled widely. "Okay," she said, "but only because it's my birthday and I'm in a good mood." Naruto decided to let that one pass. "Is sex really that important to you?" Naruto asked her, genuinely curious. Anko's appetite was infamous throughout Konoha, and according to the rumor mill, every bachelor in Konoha had sampled her. That probably just meant that a large part of the shinobi bachelors had slept with her. Naruto knew how stupid the rumor mill could be, and he also knew Konoha's population numbered about 200,000, that meant 100,000 men, somewhere around 15,000 of them in the 18 to 28 age bracket that usually made up bachelors. This included counting attrition due to age in the upper brackets. Even so, he decided to knock off about 3,000 more, partly to make it more manageable and partly because many were married when they were 28. So 12,000 then. That meant that she'd have to sleep with someone every night for over 32 years straight, which fell on its own implausibility, especially since every year 1,200 more people would join the crowd. Anko raised one eyebrow at this and looked at him. "If you mean important as in, I fucking love it, yeah." Anko leaned back now, having folded her legs in under the table and using them to support herself as she leaned backwards. How so? Why? Naruto continued, as said, it is a rush when you get to the finish and the journey can be exhilarating too, but I just can't see where it becomes so wonderful that you have to spend, what is it, 5 times a week, having sex. 7 if I can manage. Anko admitted without the least hint of embarrassment over it. And I think you've kinda got the wrong idea about it all, she continued, giving him a disbelieving smile. First of all, I get multiple orgasms. Anko held up a finger now, another soon following it as a smug smile started to adorn her lips. Second, with a good partner I can be on it for hours. A third finger rose now. Third, there's about 1,000 different ways to do it and they all makes you feel good in a different way. Fourth, a fourth finger rose now, getting a good lay makes the entire next day for me, and fifth, now her last finger rose and suddenly a shadow passed over her face and her smile died. I do get lonely at times, you know, she finished, the joviality gone from her voice. Naruto blinked now, taken aback by what Anko told him. The sudden solemnity of her statement was not what Naruto had expected from her. Indeed, the whole admittance gave him a realization that was uncharted territory for him. Anko was lonely. For Naruto, who couldn't think of having seen Anko in any other mood than either sadistically eager or cheekily grinning, this was an unfamiliar situation. Lonely. The concept was absurd to Naruto. Anko was a woman he always had pegged as indomitable. She took anything with a large grin and went on, insults and hurtful actions sliding off her like water. Naruto blinked slowly before he shook his head. It doesn't make sense, he said. You'll have to explain this one to me. How does sexual gratification compensate for social isolation? Anko looked at him with a tried stare that was extremely clear in what it said. You're an idiot, is what it said, and Anko sighed and shook her head. What about this, she said, I feel needed. I feel like there's someone who gives a shit about whether I live or die, at least for a few moments. Unlike your family, mine is dead. I don't have any bratty sister worshipping me and hiding stuff in my home. When I die, there's gonna be one more name added to the memorial stone, and in about a month nobody will remember me as anything other than Orochimaru's apprentice. I'm fine with that, this is my life, who I am, and I like doing what I do. But if I can for at least a few seconds feel like there's someone who would cry when they carve the name on the memorial, I'd rather take that than lying alone every bloody night. Anko grabbed hold of the first bottle of sake and took a deep swig of it, the liquid having cooled enough that she could do this without scalding herself. You get how jealous I am at you at times, she continued, glaring at him. Your family loves you like hell, and they are only looking for a chance to shower you with apologies for how they dumped you with the old snake and forgot about you. But you? You've got your head stuck up your ass so far that you can smell your own breath, and won't even look up from your microscope to see what you've got right in front of you. This spiel again. Naruto began, having been heard that many times before. I understand how you mean, but why do I owe everyone else to fix things up with my family? Is it because it is impolite to everyone without family that I do not care for them? When did my private life become a matter of official scrutiny? Yeah, it's such a burden to have people who love you and accept who you are. Anko drawled, you arrogant prick, what the hell do you think will happen? That you'll lose your ability to do research? Are you only able to do one thing at a time? What about breathing? You have to stop staring into your microscope to do that? Naruto saw where this was heading. The worst part was that he couldn't admit what he stood to lose. The troves of knowledge and the labs he had salvaged from Orochimaru demanded all his attention as it was, and if he came closer to his family he'd run too much of risk to be discovered. He had to settle this, preferably quickly. I never said it was a burden, he said, making soothing gestures, but neither is it anything I want. I simply don't care, I have my own life and they aren't involved in that. Bullshit. Anko snorted, you're more screwed up than me, Naruto. We were that psycho's apprentices for over a decade both. You remember how it was, you seriously think that you've walked away without any issues from that? I remember how you cried in fear more times than I can count, and then one day out of nowhere you become the block of ice you are today. If you're trying to sell me that you ain't got some issues from that, you're gonna be the biggest liar in Konoha. Don't single me out, Anko. Naruto said now, about to lose his cool. We're shinobi. Do you think this work lends itself to mental health? That's what I'm saying, you idiot. Anko sighed. You're already in a business that'll screw you up royally, and if you haven't got anyone who is there to be important to you, what do you have when everything go to shit? You're already afraid enough to be hurt that you're a machine who holds your family away from you. Stop ignoring the fact that you've got issues and deal with them. Aren't scientists supposed to see the entire picture? Naruto was on the verge of sighing. Anko was so off the mark as she could be. He wasn't a hurt little kid or broken victim of his life. He was the man who had conspired to kill his master to take over his underground laboratory network and who was prepared to manipulate his father for more funding. Even Anko had maternal instincts, it seemed, and those were currently making her see not Naruto the shinobi, but Naruto the child. Still, it worked in Naruto's favor. Anko's blindness would make it easier for Naruto to hide what he was doing. He'd still have to disarm the situation somehow though. Perhaps you should focus on your problems instead, he said, trying to turn this around. I'm a grown man, I can handle this myself. Shouldn't you be the one doing something about your problems? Why do you think I'm drinking? Anko asked, sourly taking a swig from her bottle. Now that sounds like a damn good solution to me. Naruto and Anko both started as a giant bottle of sake landed on the table. Both turned to look who owned the bottle and was met with the group of 5 shinobi who had shared the bottle by one of the table. Shiranui Genma, Yamashiro Aoba, and Namishi Rado. First now Naruto recognized the last two, the 2 young Chunins Hagain Kotetsu and Kamizuki Izumo. All of them looked really drunk. Mind if we sit down, too? Rado asked. You've got a present for me? Anko asked. It's my birthday, you see. Her words made the group hesitate and look at each other. Anko looked at them with an open expression, utterly neutral and patient. Naruto winced at the sight, knowing that Anko was on the hunt. When they said no, she'd use that expression to grind them into dust with guilt. It was then that Genma smiled and pushed over the bottle to Anko. Happy birthday to you, the man smiled, starting to wave his arms to make the others join in. Happy birthday to you, the entire group sung how. Happy birthday dear Anko, happy birthday to you. The voices of the 5 drunken shinobi created a terrible mess of a choir as they all, in different paces and scales, tried to sing the short verse. Yet, Anko sat on her pillow with eyes wide open. She stared at the 5 men as they sang to her, and Naruto was sober enough to realize she was blushing. As the 5 men all finished singing, Anko was speechless and blinked for a few seconds, her eyes locked at the group standing by the table and her mouth opening and closing. After those few seconds had passed though, she sat up and grabbed the large bottle. With a mighty heave she put it to her lips and started swallowing the contents in large mouthfuls, and it was nearly 30 seconds before she put it down with a large bang, having downed almost half a liter. Cheers rose from the other shinobi and Anko slammed a hand into the table. You pass, she yelled, her eyes glittering with manic joy. Sit down and let's get ready to party. Slave, more drinks, she yelled at Naruto, who realized that the evening was over. From now on it was headway to unconsciousness for these people. As he went to the bar he slowly shook his head, wondering why he did this. Still, it wasn't for nothing that a tiny smile settled over his face. As stupid as it was cathartic too. It was with a slight groan that Naruto opened his eyes. His head was pounding as he slowly looked around the room with one eye. Somehow he had managed to get home after last night despite the humongous drinking binge, and he had even gotten into bed. Naruto slowly sat up in bed and started to mentally recount the events of last night. After the other shinobi had sat down by their table, they had started drinking with a much greater fervor. Anko's sudden happiness over what had happened had put her on the verge of crying, and she had hidden it with raucous partying. The other shinobi hadn't been slow to join in, and Naruto, even though he tried to take it easy, was more or less forced to drink at their pace by Anko. The whole thing had become a wild party of the exact variant that Anko thrived in. If he remembered correctly, she had been all over Genma by 12 o'clock, which was also somewhere where Naruto had lost his memories of what had happened. The last thing he remembered was Izumo and Kotetsu hanging on him and declaring that they had the utmost respect for Naruto and that they thought Naruto was a true shinobi who didn't deserve treatment he got from the rest of the village. It had been a surprise to hear the two Chunin confess this, even though he doubted they would have said it without that amount of alcohol in them. Speaking of alcohol, Naruto felt like shit and he started to do a mental checkup of himself. The amount of ethanol, the scientific name for the alcohol in liquors, he had consumed yesterday had dehydrated him, leading to headache, dry mouth and the feeling of lethargy. Furthermore, inside the liver the ethanol had been converted to other chemicals, sparking a series of reactions that led to the feeling of nausea and, should he be so unlucky, diarrhea, vomiting and flatulence. The other symptoms of weakness, hypersalivation, sweating, sensitivity to light and a murderous hunger were present as well. Naruto slowly got up from the bed, knowing what he had to do now. As he passed through the hallways, he mentally checked off what he needed for this. Getting to the kitchen, he started to rummage through the cupboards and fridge after what he needed, eventually having it all out on the workbench. He tried to ignore the nausea and focused at the task at hand, heating the plates and digging a frying pan out of a cupboard. Cooking was never something he had put any special pride in, but he did acknowledge the benefits of a varied diet, therefore he was skilled enough that he could create at least decent meals. It took about half an hour, but eventually his hangover remedy was ready. 2 bacon, egg and cheese sandwiches along with another 2 fried eggs to increase the cysteine and amino acid levels in the body and replenish the lowered salt levels. A glass of orange juice and a glass of milk to rehydrate the body and to gain calcium and vitamin C. A 3rd glass of baking soda dissolved in water against the nausea. Unless he was going to medicate himself, something definitely not recommended in this state, this was as good a cure as he could come up with. The empty glass and the equally empty plate standing on the table suggested that he had eaten before he went to bed too. Naruto was grateful that he had done so, he shuddered to think of how he would have felt if he hadn't done so. Sitting down to eat, he chomped down on the sandwich, savoring the taste. Idly, his thoughts came to visit Anko and he wondered how she would feel now. Probably twice as hungover as him and lying clamped between 1 or 2 of the shinobi they had been drinking with. Genma would definitely be there, perhaps Raider too considering their close friendship and Anko's appetite. Naruto almost pitied his fellow apprentice, he couldn't imagine it being especially fun to be hungover and wake up with people you didn't really know. After the breakfast was finished Naruto paid a visit to the bathroom and afterwards he leapt into the shower, taking a cold shower to help his body reactivate. The kick of the adrenaline did a lot to activate him even though it momentarily aggravated the symptoms, not the least the headache. He was done in about 2 minutes and wiped himself off quickly. Thankfully it was a warm spring and he could let the hair dry naturally, he didn't like having to sit with a hair dryer for an hour. Perhaps he should cut it short. It was as he got out of the bathroom that he felt the smell of hangover that had been settled throughout the apartment. He opened what windows he could and cleaned up the kitchen, already feeling better. Glancing at the clock, he noticed that he had an hour left and decided to take a short walk. Today was Friday and the lab would only work half-time, starting afternoon. However, Friday also meant weekly checkup. Once every week he had to go to the hospital and get examined by Heisei Rin, one of his father's students and also one of the best medic neens in Konoha. After his master's death it had been for the best to alleviate some of the suspicions against him by agreeing to the checkups. His alien metabolism and body functions unnerved most people and there were also, admittedly, some legitimate concerns about what Orochimaru had done to him. As much as Naruto liked to claim otherwise, he did not understand everything that had been done to him. He could figure it out, there was no doubt about that, but they were too occupied at the lab to allow him time to do that. At the moment, however, it was for the best to consent to the checkups and be grateful for the fact that if anything happened it would be discovered. Putting on his shinobi clothing he idly thought about how much they made him stand out from the crowd, even amongst shinobi. As Orochimaru's apprentice he had been given permission to dress in whatever way that was optimal for his training and the wide, snow-white shirt along with the maroon sash and trousers made him an exotic figure. Still, they made him distinct and for shinobi at his level the benefits outweighed the cost, making him easily recognizable added to his intimidation capability. Also, the wide shirt was easy to pull down, freeing his chest and giving him better flexibility, something vital at his level of agility. Of course he couldn't wear it in the lab, the sleeves could knock over things, catch on fire or any number of other things. This forced him to use the kind of standard clothes most shinobi used when he worked there. Nevertheless, now he that could wear the outfit he felt at home in, and when he had finished cleaning up and making the apartment spotless again, he left it, heading for the hospital. He didn't go straight for the hospital though, instead using the opportunity to take a brisk walk around Konoha. Light exercise was also one of the remedies. It made the blood start pumping again and increased the oxygen levels throughout the body. Outside the sky was overcast, throwing a gloom over the city. Still, there was no rain in the air, and judging from the looks of it, a brisk wind was pushing the clouds away, blue sky being visible in the far distance. Naruto savored the air and the lack of piercing sunlight as he made his way down the stairs to the main street, since despite the food and the shower his head still hurt and sunlight wouldn't have helped. There were no cures for hangovers after all, only time could nullify the symptoms, the other methods only mitigated them. About an hour later Naruto made his way into the Konoha hospital, pushing the double doors open and walking inside the waiting room. The fresh air and the cool wind that blew through Konoha did wonders for his headache, and he felt nearly totally recovered. Thankful of this fact, he made his way to the third floor where the waiting room for advanced medicine was. He was right on time, his session with Rin beginning at 9 exactly. Naruto entered the small, comfortable waiting room, noticing that it was empty as usual, and sat down on one of the plastic chairs lining the walls. Leaning back into the chair, Naruto put up one leg on the other knee and rested his arm on the armrest, supporting his head with his hand. He never looked forwards to these checkups. It wasn't that Rin was unskilled, far from it, it was her meddling. A student of his father like Hatake Kakashi, Heisei Rin had during her first years as a shinobi seen one of her teammates, a young Uchiha who had been in love with her, die. The event had deeply affected the then 12-year-old girl, and she had retired from active duty, requesting transfer to the hospital. Nowadays she was well respected and the second in command of Konoha's medical shinobi, second in skill and clout, both only to the head of the hospital. Yet, the scars after her dead teammate was still there, and she had, ever since Naruto became her patient, steadily worked with trying to bring Naruto back with his family. She couldn't stand seeing people who should be close being apart from each other, and it reflected in these meetings. Like Enko had shown herself to think last night, Rin was convinced that Naruto was a hurt and miserable child longing for his family. Was it only Orochimaru who had faced him as an adult? It seemed as if the rest of Konoha thought he was the same person he had been when he had been turned over to his former master, a small and confused child. Even worse was the part that he, whenever he talked with her, couldn't really bring himself to fully believe that he wasn't either. Footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up just in time to see Rin enter the waiting room. As always, she was wearing the doctor's coat, and her warm brown eyes shone with kindness, accentuated by her kind smile. Naruto got up and took Rin's extended hand. "Here we go again," Rin said to him, jokingly referring to the routine that had started to arise here. Having to do this once every week was quickly starting to lose what little charm it had had to start with. Naruto shrugged, having long since accepted the need for these tests. He didn't see any need to tell her the reason he disliked doing this was the fact that if he didn't cooperate here and stay the full hour, he'd be marked down as uncooperative, something he couldn't afford. He silently followed Rin into the examination room and pulled down his shirt, knowing what was to come. The wide shirt was open at the front, giving him the ability to fold it down on the sides. "So how has the week been, Naruto-kun?" Rin asked him as he sat down on the bed inside the examining room. "Tiresome." Naruto sighed, with the blood nin on the loose we're being run ragged to find countermeasures. If we dare to say that we're hard-pressed to find a solution, they think we're just being lazy. He rolled his eyes at the concept, and Rin chuckled now. Thankfully, she knew how working in the labs was. "As always," she said. "It's a pity they don't understand," she continued as she turned around with a small syringe in her hand. He silently held out one arm and Rin put the syringe to the skin by the armpit. Focusing, the woman pushed her chakra into the needle, and as the needle begun to glow, it slowly sunk into his skin, taking almost half a minute to get all the way through. It seems as if the subdermal snakeskin has thickened. Rin mused as she extracted a blood sample from him. We should check that. When she had filled the syringe, she pulled it out and expertly covered the spot where she had pierced the skin with a tissue. Naruto took it over and held it against the skin. As Rin put the blood sample into a testing machine, he glanced at the tiny wound, seeing that it had already closed. Within 10 seconds, he said. His regeneration remained unchanged. Naruto already knew that, but it was best to let Rin make her conclusions. People believed and trusted what she said, not so with him. That means the regeneration has remained the same. Rin said, let's take a look under your skin. She said as she took a small circular metal piece from the desk and put it against his skin. Are you ready? She asked, and Naruto nodded, knowing what would come. With a powerful twist, Rin dug the razor-sharp end of the tube into his skin. Naruto could feel the pain, but he did not even flinch, having gotten used to the dulled pain responses. Rin quickly removed the tube, the circular patch of skin she had cut away following, and under his pale skin something unseen before amongst humans was revealed. Snakeskin, pale white snakeskin was visible through the wound, flexing slightly as Naruto moved his muscles. He still wasn't used to this sight, the reminder of his unnaturalness. Rin took up a scalpel and began to press it against the snakeskin, forcing the small blade against the scales. She pressed it quite hard, the blade in the end almost bending from the pressure, yet the snakeskin did not give way even 1 millimeter. As his human skin slowly started to cover the snakeskin again, Rin removed the scalpel and nodded to herself. It strengthened all right, she said. I could probably pierce it with a sword if I stabbed hard enough, but almost light weapons will do. To this is scratching the outer skin. Were you planning to take any tissue samples? Naruto asked. If so, she'd have to extract them with a chakra scalpel. However, Rin shook her head. I don't think so, she said, at least not now. As aggressive as it is, we know it's not malignant. It might be worth doing a couple of MRIs though, and I'd like to set another appointment for a full batch of samples. Still, there's no panic, you can go on with your everyday life for now. Glad to hear it. Naruto said, surprised that she hadn't started to talk about his personal life yet. Yet, the old saying, speak of the devil, came true now as Rin's next topic turned out to be just that. So how has life been other than work? Rin asked, picking up a notepad which she began to scribble on. I heard that Mitarashi-san had her birthday yesterday. Rin didn't like Enko one bit, thinking that the woman was too unstable and too violent. Naruto had already figured that out, yet she did not show it now, instead smiling openly at him upon asking the question. The rumor mill seems to be working quickly here. Naruto remarked, yes, it was her birthday, she dragged me off to Maki's. Did any of the people we were drinking with come here with alcohol poisoning? He added, thinking it was best to check with her. Rin chuckled at his question. Sorry Naruto-kun, she said, those things are confidential after all. Naruto shrugged, having expected that, and Rin continued. How was it? She asked, and Naruto looked up at the ceiling. Eventually, he decided to answer, what harm would it do to talk about it? It was enjoyable, he admitted. I'm not as big on it as Enko, but it feels cathartic to do it once in a while. Cathartic how? Rin asked, and Naruto explained. If you get too bogged down thinking about something, you'll eventually freeze mentally. You won't get anywhere since you're too deeply entrenched. Things like these free up the mind and lets you mentally start anew the next day. Good thinking, Naruto-kun. Rin said with a smile, there are many people twice your age that has yet to grasp that. Many people twice my age aren't me. Naruto said dryly, provoking Rin to look up at him with a wry smile. Now be nice, she told him, let's just check your lungs and heart and wrap this up. She took the stethoscope from its resting place around her neck and put the plugs in her ear. The cold metal soon landed on Naruto's chest and he took a deep breath, letting his lungs fill up, and exhaled after a few seconds. May I ask you something, Naruto-kun? Rin asked after he had taken a pair of breaths. What? He asked. Do you ever feel uncomfortable in your body? Naruto almost felt like he had gotten a punch in the gut now. The air got stuck in his throat and he coughed, making Rin jump slightly as the cough resounded in the stethoscope. What brought this about? Naruto asked as he cleared his throat. Just a question, Rin told him, with all that's happened to you I thought it would be a good idea to ask. Okay. Naruto said, feeling very uncomfortable suddenly. Was he? He had never thought of it like that before, but now what she said it he started to wonder. No, was the immediate answer, I'm not sure, was the second thought that plopped into his head. Looking down at his arm, where the skin had now fully healed, he found himself unable to come to a satisfying answer to whether he was. I don't know, he said after a while adding, I don't think so. It's the price I paid as a shinobi and I've got you to check me up. Furthermore, the benefits are massive for me as a shinobi, and even if people think I look unpleasant that's not enough to really outweigh it. Why do you think that people feel you're unpleasant? Rin asked him, Naruto sighing now. Heisei-sensei, he said, looking at her with a patient look on his face. I'm a snake, last time I checked the Orochimaru style was not the vogue. I am more or less a carbon copy of that man, only with a slight palette swap, and everyone who looks at me are reminded of him. Yes, I think I'm considered creepy around here. I'm not so sure about that. Rin said, I've actually heard people say otherwise. Yeah, well, idiots are 13 a dozen. Naruto said, dismissing the whole idea. There are people who think that Madara was a hero as well, all you can do is to ignore them and hope they grow up. Are they idiots because they don't agree with you? Rin asked carefully, making Naruto grit his teeth. Heisei-sensei, he said, glaring at her. Think. I am thinking. Rin said, and I don't see what you mean. You're you, not Orochimaru, and people know how much you sacrificed for Konoha, why are you so insistent that they should only see your master and not you? Naruto sighed, actually not finding any answers. He leaned forwards and suddenly he remembered something. A chuckle escaped him now. Utmost respect, he said, quoting the two Chunin yesterday. Rin raised an eyebrow and Naruto clarified. It was a pair of the people we were drinking with, they had the utmost respect for me. And I never doubted that I would get acknowledgement as a shinobi. That's not the issue. Do you want to talk about the real issue? Rin asked and Naruto shrugged. It's the fact that when most of Konoha looks at me it sees a 7-year-old child, he told her. Boo-hoo, poor suffering little boy, what a tragic life, how he must suffer. But I don't. He stood up, feeling too aggravated to sit down. I don't suffer, he said, I don't regret what's happened, I'm not unhappy and I don't need a shoulder to cry on. Then what do you feel about it? Rin asked. Naruto found himself stumped. Really, what could he say now? The only thing he felt about Orochimaru was triumph over his success and contentment that the despicable maniac was dead. Yet how the heck could he tell her that? That he had conspired to kill Orochimaru and take over his organization? That he was glad it had succeeded and now could feel almost giddy over the possibilities this meant for him? Happy, he said eventually, it was technically the truth. Rin raised an eyebrow here and Naruto clarified. For all that Orochimaru was, he was never a father to me, he was a source of knowledge. He challenged me, drove me to improve and guided me to become who I am. Yet, he did it for his purposes only. I, the person I am, was never a part of his thinking. It's how things were really, he used me, I used him. There was no love between us. And he betrayed Konoha. He did all those things you have heard about. He deserved what was coming to him, he betrayed all that this village stands for and he paid the price for that. What about the things that you stand for? Rin asked him, yet again hitting right on the spot and forcing Naruto to stop and think. Eventually, he spoke the truth. Science is a tool to serve man. Naruto said, sometimes sacrifices has to be made but overall, it can't, mustn't, violate the basic foundations of man. What are those? For one, free will. Naruto said, a shinobi can choose to drop out of academy, he can choose to refuse missions, he can choose to retire. Of course, there might be consequences, but he can still do it. Prison and banishment might both be preferable options to him, and if so, he can act on it. Those people in those labs? They never had that. They were taken, twisted, made into monsters, without any chance to say no. He had abandoned science and was playing God, toying with other people to satisfy nothing but his base power lust. That's in the other direction of what I believe in, and he wouldn't stop, never, so he had to die. Do you feel that the human experiments in themselves were not something wrong, merely the way he conducted them? Rin asked, making Naruto look at her before nodded. Yes, he said, with proper surveillance, people who volunteered as subjects, good routines for giving the subjects medical attention if needed and making sure to minimize the risks for them, there's no logical reason to forbid it. You think? Rin asked. Yes. Naruto exclaimed, of course, there are people who will say, no, you can't. It's an abomination to nature. We were abominations to nature as soon as we begun wielding chakra. The sage of the six paths supposedly created the moon. What's natural about that? They are following their instincts, the same animal instincts that tell them, he made you angry, hurt him, or she's beautiful, take her. Is that the kind of things that should forge the decisions we make? Blind fear and conservatism? Yes, we are walking into dangerous territory, but that's no reason to stop. That has never been a reason to stop, why should it be that now? We aren't at the end of history, as some people want to claim, we're in the middle of it. It's still floating on, and if we start thinking we've discovered what we need, according to some arbitrary standard, we'll fall in the end, like all powers who stopped changing and developing did. What's your view of it all? Rin continued, silently listening to him with an attentive face. They view what I do as an abomination when I am making certain that not only will Konoha live and thrive tomorrow, it will be equipped to stand in 100 years. Naruto said with a dry voice. And the only reason they don't treat me like my master is that they are too busy pitying me. Yes, I am kind of annoyed by this. I understand. Rin said. Yet as you said, hadn't a pair of chunin come to respect you? Might that not mean that there are more people out there who do it? I'm not going to hold my breath. Naruto said. Why not? Because people are stupid, Naruto said. And Konoha has put a pride in despising all that I do: murder, poison, torture, theft. That's all fine when it's done for Konoha, but the things I do aren't. I won't apologize for how I serve Konoha, and they'll hate me for it. You don't think you can change how they look at you? Rin offered, making Naruto shake his head. As said, I'm not going to apologize, he said. I have better things to do than to grovel in front of narrow-minded idiots in order to make them see what they should have seen to start with. Do you have to grovel? Rin asked. You're right, they are wrong to condemn you, but unless you give them a chance, how can they know? Science is hard for many to understand, and if you give them a chance to understand more easily, I think many could come to their senses. Naruto begun before he stopped, and a chuckle escaped him as he realized what he had been about to say. I shouldn't have to, he said with a dry voice, realizing the pettiness he was showing. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this what if and want to see next part of it, comment down below and let me know. Also share this video with your friends. See you in the next video. Peace.